Hi, Diefesters. My name is Rudnov Vincent, and I am the founder of Diefest Global. A warm welcome to you all on the third edition. This year, Diefest will focus on the future of work by addressing authenticity, belongingness, and social impact as some of the most important practices for building a more inclusive and purpose driven workplace for everyone to thrive. Before we begin, I would like to humbly thank our belonging partner, Newsilla, for supporting our initiative in democratizing world class content and promoting equity in education. On this note, I would like to welcome you to our session on mindfulness, a powerful tool for equity and inclusion in the workplace. Our moderator for today is the co founder and chief scientific officer at the Academy of Brain Based Leadership. He also serves as the executive director of CNS Research and Development at AbbVie. He holds a bachelor's in psychology, master's in biopsychology, and PhD in neuroscience. He has co authored the book Psychological Safety: The Key to Happy, High Performing People and Teams. He has been a guest editor on a special issue of the Journal of Continuing Psychology, written several peer reviewed scientific articles that have been published in the Harvard Business Review. Please welcome Dan Radecki.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Heather, I know our topic here is mindfulness and inclusion, and there's so much to talk about in a half hour. Um, and as a neuroscientist, of course, my passion is talking about the brain and how this relates to it. And Heather, you being in an organizational setting and having used a lot of this content in the real world and seeing the benefit of it, you can speak to that. But before we get started, I really just wanted to talk about what we mean by mindfulness, because it's sort of ambiguous word, concept, idea. People have different notions of what it means. And I think of when we're talking about mindfulness, we're really thinking about a mindful state, as opposed to, there's mindfulness training, right? And there's many ways to do mindfulness training. And the way I see it from the brain's perspective, why these two things, mindfulness and inclusion in the workplace, really go hand in hand, is because of the way the brain, just the way the brain is developed, right? We have this brain that over the years has evolved to be really good at reacting to and detecting threat. And it's organized that way. It has many systems that are very sensitive to this. And that's great. That was great in the years as we were evolving as humans. But that really sensitive threat response can get us into trouble these days. And what it does is it creates biases for us, and that's where the whole problem comes in with embracing, truly, not just tolerating, but embracing inclusion and diversity, because we've got this brain that if it sees someone who's different or different than me, who I'm not familiar with, it's going to err on the side of caution, right? And so I think what the story is what we find in neuroscience is that by strengthening areas of the brain that allow us to get over our, let's call it the old brain's threat response to things that are new. By strengthening these areas of the brain, we can actually, as humans, uniquely to humans maybe, mitigate this in-group versus out-group. And it allows us to really, truly embrace, like I said, diversity and inclusion, and not just do lip service to it. So I'm curious, Heather, in your experience, what has your focus been on in organizational settings with this?
Yeah, so as a practitioner, I think it's about being mindful. And of course, mindfulness is a practice that helps us be present in those situations. But I think it's like just being conscious to what's happening. So I think of that, especially in the work setting, of really being aware when something may start to trigger me or to trigger that old brain and go, wait, this doesn't feel comfortable. It's the things we do to keep ourselves safe or that are self-protective that work against equity, that work against inclusion, because we're kind of wired to make sure that we survive. And that sometimes can put us in a place where we become more susceptible to our biases. We don't even realize it because we get more on that autopilot. And so it's that pause that being mindful allows to stop for a minute and say, what is this? Where is this landing for me? Why is this triggering me the way that it is? And how do I want to show up in this situation? Do I want to be reactive, or do I want to take a different approach? And to me, that's really what it's about. But mindfulness practice helps you develop that skill. But it's like being conscious, being mindful in every interaction that we have, so that we show up the way we want and create the spaces that we want.
Yeah, and I think going back to the neuroscience, that we talk a lot about trust.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's another word like mindfulness. It can be very ambiguous and subjective. The way that we see trust to the brain is it's simple, as I mentioned before. Are you part of my in group, or are you part of my out group? And that's the way the brain organizes our world, unfortunately, like many other species. But the unique thing about humans is we have this part of our brain, that higher brain, that can allow us to override that. Um, and so we can actually, through mindfulness training, through being continuing to be mindful and to be cognizant of being mindful, we can actually build up, and we use the term build resilience. So build a resilient brain so that you can manage that in group versus out group. And that's going to allow us then to, like you say, take that pause. That pause is difficult for many
Very
people,
difficult.
right? It's difficult, and there's a biological reason why it's difficult, because like you mentioned it, we're on autopilot most of our lives with our decision making and our behaviors. So it's not surprising then that, because it's the path of least resistance, it's easy for our brain. But the fact that it's difficult to take just a millisecond pause and step out of your own preconceived notions and biases, it means that you have to be intentional in training your brain to do that. And we found of late in neuroscience research that we can actually train our brain. It's not as sort of fixed as you may think. So that's one of the things we believe, the beauty of mindful and mindfulness training is that you can build these networks up to help you manage that in group versus out group. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, just like a muscle. And the end result could be that you're more likely to embrace someone, even though they're different, have a different perspective than you. And that's something that's very powerful. I know that I've seen in doing this training over the years, and I've seen it in my personal life and even in my work teams.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. When I think about bringing this work into an organization, and I'm in my second organization where I'm doing this now, the teaching people about the brain is so powerful to help them understand. And at first, there was a little resistance because they're like, why do I need to know all this? Like, that seems like mumbo jumbo. But when they start to understand neurobiologically what is happening and why biases come into play, why we react the way we do, why others may react the way they do, it seems to flip a switch easier than when we just teach it from, if you want to call them soft skills. I think they're some of the hardest skills, but when we try to teach the skill of feedback or the skill of communication without the neuroscience behind it, even at just that very basic level, like you just talked about, it makes all the difference in the world. I've done it with engineers, I've done it with accountants, and they are so much more receptive to the tools behind it when they understand, wow, I'd rather work with somebody's brain rather than try and fight these things that are just happening. And it makes all the difference in the world. And I think I'm more mindful using your work with the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership because I understand that people have these needs for trust, these needs for fairness, that I start to think about how I'm communicating in a way that honors that. Like, is there something I could say that could unintentionally trigger that? And that's another form of mindfulness, like mindful communication. How am I trying to interact with them in a way that honors them?
Yeah, because that's the big question. I know a lot of people say, well, how do I do this? It's so difficult to take that pause and to really be conscious of what I'm doing and what I'm saying. And there's a buzz phrase now, psychological safety, right? Everyone talks about psychological safety. It's been around, ironically, for decades, but now there's since Google did some publication on it and some work, there's been an explosion of research and people trying to get at what is it? How can we build it? And how can we measure it? And I think as we look at the research of how important it is, there's industry research, there's academic research, this whole idea of psychological safety, I think it goes along this continuum of being mindful and being able to be inclusive. Because when you truly look at psychological safety, you could argue that it's difficult to have an environment of inclusivity unless people feel psychologically safe.
Oh,
And from a
absolutely.
brain perspective, that's the approach that we take when we're teaching this. And I don't know if you verbalize that on your teams. Is that something that they understand, and what your experience has been with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to me, I'm the director of learning and development. There is no true learning. I think everything else that we talk about becomes surface level if we're not putting that strong foundation of what psychological safety is and what does it mean to develop it. I can't truly learn if it's not psychologically safe for me to do so,
Yeah.
because I'm not going to be allowed to make the mistakes. I'm not going to be allowed to fail because there's too much risk involved. I'm not going to be able to innovate because there's too much risk involved. I'm not going to develop those deeper, more authentic relationships because it's not safe to speak up, or it's not safe to ask a question that I may not understand. So I mean, luckily I've worked in two organizations that have really, really valued people. And I don't think I could do my work in a place that didn't, because I don't think I can do anything in the organization that's going to be really effective from a leadership development or a learning standpoint if we can't start with that foundation of psychological safety.
Yeah, and
100%.
unfortunately, I think a lot of people understand it or recognize it when it's not present, when psychologically
Oh,
when you're in a toxic cultures, by definition, a lot of times are cultures, if you look at how people describe them, that aren't psychologically safe. And I mean, I think it's ironic that we spend so much of our time in the corporate world worried about environmental health safety and the physical safety, and we a lot of times we neglect the psychological safety. It still isn't that long since in the corporate world, we would say, well, we don't talk about emotions. We don't deal with that stuff at work. That's something that we don't really, we don't have the capacity to talk about. I think there's a lot of understanding now about how important psychological safety is, just as, or in some cases, more important than physical safety. And not just the fact that it is, but then what do you do about it? How do I know if I'm not feeling psychologically safe? What is going to trigger me? Because
mm,
psychological safety is akin to stress. If you don't have psychological safety, your brain's gonna react as a stress response. And we're starting to find out some very sort of scary things that stress does to the brain, and some of which you mentioned before. The inability to be creative or to be productive or to be collaborative. And so one of the things that we talk about as well is taking ownership of your own psychological safety. How do I know what is going to trigger me? Let me be proactive. If I think that, to me, a sense of autonomy in my job, I like to lead, I like to be in control. If that's important to me, then I know that about myself. Then I need to be aware of when I'm in situations where I don't have that, where maybe someone else is in control, and I may feel like I'm being micromanaged, and that may induce stress in my brain. So the ability to go back to what you said earlier of saying, let me just have that self-awareness, stop, take a pause, and reflect on this. Reflect on what my brain is going through and how it may impact me. Even a split second, the research shows it can have a profound impact on how your brain becomes stressed or lack thereof. So I think I agree. I totally agree with you. The ability to just understand a little bit about the brain and self-awareness seems to be a tremendous asset for helping with this.
yeah, and I love what you're talking about, because for me, the power is in the language. And I think before I was introduced to the safety model, which is your approach to how we deal with psychological safety, I didn't have language to talk about some of the things that like I needed and why they were important to me and how they helped me be high performing. And as we rolled this out within teams and we taught them how to use the language, exactly what you described is, in the past, I would have sat in that meeting and been like, that's it. I'm not, they've taken away my ability to think about how I would approach this and withdraw, back out, shut down, all of those things. We now, within the teams that I work on, say, hold on, my need for autonomy is really being threatened here, and I own it. I'm not saying you just took away my autonomy or you're taking control of this. It's about what I need. And because we've all made this commitment that we want to create a high performing, psychologically safe environment, that's our cue to each other to go, okay, pause. What's going on? What would help you here? And they may not be able to give me all of it, but if I can voice it, it definitely keeps me from shutting down and me from withdrawing, and allows my team to show up in a way that's better for me. And that's true for all of us, that anybody at any time can speak up and say, hey, this needs being threatened or this needs not being met. And that's our signal to pause and say, how can I support you? What information could I give you? How would you like to approach this? So it's language has made all the difference in the world.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And as humans, language is critical for us for communication, obviously. And being able to just put some simple words around a concept like I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling psychologically unsafe, and just very simply people understanding that. I had a similar incidences with my teams, and once they understood the context of psychological safety and the need to appease everyone's brain's need for it, because we all have a need for it. Someone simply standing up and saying, "My fairness is being challenged." Right
Yep.
there, the group stopped, and this was someone who we needed to be creative in the moment, and they weren't, because they were felt that they were being marginalized. And once they said my fairness was being challenged, everyone stopped, knew what that meant,
Yep.
and gave her that room. And it could have gone horribly wrong if we did not have that language, because I'm sure she would have stood up and yelled and screamed and become emotional, and that has sort of a, you know, downward spiral effect on everyone around you. So the language, yes, totally agree how important that is. And I think what's interesting about all of this is we talk about mindfulness, being mindful as a way to build this capacity in the brain. But there are some really positive side effects of building the capacity to be mindful. We're talking about it here in terms of being able to enhance psychological safety, then as a way to build inclusivity and the ability to embrace inclusivity and diversity. But it also has physical benefits to us. We're finding in the field of neuroscience that this system that you're building up by being mindful, it may be involved in mental illness. Dysfunction of this system may lead to depression and anxiety, which we're dealing with, epidemic of these mental health issues in this country. So the ability to be able to build this area of the brain up, it has probably multiple positive impacts on our brain and our body. And I just think that it's wonderful to be able to get to some of this research and make it come to life.
Yeah, let me share a personal example too, because I know we're talking about the workplace, but even without formal training. So I have a daughter who's 20, she'll be 21 next month. And she's lived in my household. She knows I do this work, but I've never sat and taught her the models of what we do, but she knows how we communicate with her. And what I think is the coolest thing is watching her as a young adult navigating her world. She's at college, she's navigating a new relationship. And what she does, how she's taught herself to be mindful in those situations is she'll call me up and she'll say, Mom, here's what's going on. I'm really stressed out. This is going on. This is going on. And the story I'm making up about that is, and she's like, I just need to talk through it. She doesn't have all the language to say what her needs are. Like she hasn't been taught those models, but that's being mindful, is to recognize that my brain's running away with me. I'm making up this story that I'm not going to have anything set up for next year. Be like, she's struggling, she's graduating. So she's struggling with what the next step is. And she took a bad day and had it blown up into that her whole career was over and she would never, be able to be successful in life because she didn't have her plan laid out. But she recognized it as a story, and that it was just her brain doing to her what her brain does, because she has a higher need for security and likes predictability, and it was feeling very out of control in that moment. And I think that's so cool that she can do that for herself and know how to go get support for it. So it doesn't
Well,
have to be fancy with,
it
fancy
doesn't.
terms.
And we hear this a lot, not just the simplicity of it. I mean, I've done similar training like this with 8-year-olds, and they get it,
Yeah.
and they can use it, so it's applicable to everyone. And I think one of the benefits of this is that you take your brain everywhere you go. So if it
We
works with
hope.
your
We
team,
hope.
you hope, if it works into your team in the workplace setting, when you go home, what we've heard is, wow, this is carrying over to my relationships
Yes.
outside of work, and that's
Yes.
that's great. I think that's why there's been so much interest in this. um, so I think as we teach this, and as we get into this more and more, and the research evolves, we're getting to a point where we're finding just so many benefits that we didn't even think about prior to this. And um, and I think that having taught this for a long time, and hearing some of the success stories, it's really rewarding personally, to hear how it's impacting people's lives, not just in the workplace setting, but outside of it. But I think the other thing about this is bringing it back to equity and inclusion and diversity. We've got this brain. There's some fascinating research around this that I like to talk about. But just as an illustration of how good our brain is at fooling us, like you talked about your daughter, or getting into
Yeah.
this what we call ruminating, where you get involved in these thought patterns and you can't get rid of them. But what's lurking beneath the surface of this old brain of ours? I keep saying old brain, this brain that it hasn't matched the evolution of society. Our brain hasn't evolved to the point society has, and it causes some problems. But there's some fascinating research showing that at its very core, all of our brains are biased.
Hmm.
Hey, if you have a brain, you're biased, and it simply is going to react, that old brain, to something new or someone new in a negative way. It's going to see them as a threat until otherwise proven to be safe, and sometimes that's difficult to do. So I think I take a simplistic approach, like you're saying. We have we have this old brain that wants to be very binary and say you're good, you're bad. I like you, I don't. You're my in group, my out group. And the scary part is when someone is not part of your brain's in group. If you're part of my out group, I am not going to use the same area of my brain to deal with you as if you were part of my in group. And
Hmm.
so what happens is I don't have empathy for you. I don't have an understanding. I can't relate to you. So the trick that we're trying to perpetuate by this training is to say, let's find a way to build up the areas of our brain that will bring more people into your in group right away when you meet them. And this is what we think things like mindfulness, being mindful, understanding your triggers for psychological safety. We think these are the type of things that can enhance that can really move the needle in making you more likely to meet someone new and accept them as your in group, whereas your old brain doesn't want to do that. It's almost like we're training our high brain to override our lower brain.
Yeah, and we experienced that. So in my previous organization, we had no idea a pandemic was coming. We had no idea a large acquisition integration was coming.
Yeah.
We were just working on this because we wanted to create high performing teams. And we knew that psychological safety was the underpinning and the number one predictor of whether a team would be high performing.
Mm-hmm.
So we had done the psychological safety work with them prior to the pandemic. Almost 100% of the leaders came to me in the early days of the pandemic. So, in those first few months where everything was very ambiguous, was very uncertain, and said, I am so glad that I had this work. I would not be able my teams wouldn't be able to help themselves. I wouldn't be able to lean into these conversations to really get at how I could support somebody if we didn't have the language and I didn't know about how important creating psychological safety was. And at that point, lots of it was around security triggers. Lots of it was around fairness triggers. It didn't feel fair. And as you know, we came out of that and then went through an integration with another organization. Again, similar triggers. but were able to draw on this thing that we had started strictly to build high performance, but really helped those teams weather the time. And historically, those teams showed higher employee engagement scores every time we did it. The teams that were deep inside the psychological safety work. And I know you just worked on some recent research that proved that out academically, but we experienced it anecdotally, is those teams always had higher engagement.
Yeah, and this whole pandemic, to your point, it was almost like a global petri dish for understanding psychological safety, because
Yes.
we've seen that like you mentioned, the uncertainty associated with the pandemic from the very beginning. Remember back in the days, we thought, okay, well, a couple of weeks we're going to
Yeah,
have to
two
work from
weeks.
home, right? 2 years later, there was so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
People felt that their need for fairness just wasn't there. They didn't know, why do I have to go to, like, now, why do I have to go back to work? Why do I have to go in the office? I've adjusted to working remotely.
Mhm.
And there's just so many components that have been impacted by that. And we've seen over the past couple of years a spike in mental health disease, in depression, anxiety, all these types of things because of this. And I like your story because it almost, the way I like to view all of this is, we're building up a resilient brain, and it's almost like we're being proactive in building up this network in our brain to deal with stress and a lack of psychological safety, because we're all going to experience it, right? When we learn what stress does to our brain, first of all, it's a little scary, because I don't think people truly appreciated how much
Yeah.
of an impact it has. But then they want to know what to do about it. And it's almost like you would boost your immune system, right, with a vaccine. In this case, you're boosting your brain resilience by implementing some of these strategies. Mindfulness can be one of them, and some of the other things that we teach. Because when you do inevitably encounter stress or threats to your psychological safety, you're better equipped to deal with it and not fall apart. And I know personally, I've seen that through the pandemic. Like you said, those people, those teams who had this knowledge, they were able to weather the storm of the past 2 years. Whereas those who didn't, it had a pretty profound effect on them.
I couldn't agree more. I
Yeah.
mean, I even have noticed the shift in myself, because when I would get triggered, it would be the emotional response that would kind of run away from me. When those emotions were high, it was just, I was in the emotion. I was feeling what I was feeling. I wasn't thinking logically or rationally at all. Now I use that emotional response. I still feel it, but that's a signal to me. That's a signal to me that something is being triggered. And that's when I try to get the pause in and go, okay, why is this landing on me the way that it is? And I use the safety language, which of my needs, which needs of the safety model, is this landing on for me? Because then I can make a non-emotional decision about, okay, if my autonomy is being threatened or my fairness, okay, what do I need to go? Where can I go get facts? Where can I go get evidence to help me get out of the emotional piece, but understand that this is just a need that's not being met in the way that I need it. And that has shifted everything for me, is to not get caught up in the emotion, but be able to step back and find language to help me move forward.
Yeah. And I tell people when we teach this, if you only were able to do one thing and sort of understand what triggers you, what
Yep.
triggers your psychological safety,
Yep.
that self-awareness puts you probably ahead of 99.99% of the
Agreed.
rest of the people on this planet. Because if everyone had that understanding, and through being mindful and building up those brain regions and having self-awareness of what triggers you, it would be a different world. Not just our corporate world. It would just, the ability for us to understand each other's perspectives and get along and give each other some space, it would be amazing.
Because I really see, I know we were talking about equity and inclusion, but honestly, if you do this psychological safety work well and being mindful to that, not only for yourself, so to be able to own your own, but then commit to doing it for and with each other on a team level, at an organization level, that changes everything. And that really elevates the experience of inclusion to true belonging at that point, because
Right.
I do care about you and I want to create a great environment for you to operate in, because when I do that, I get to work with a better team. And I feel like I belong here because we do truly accept each other. I'm not just including you, I'm actually including you. And
Yeah.
that really
And
creates that
that's
true sense of
and
belonging.
that's what I love about this is because the way we look at it, yes, be mindful about our biases, understand our triggers. That's going to lead to psychological safety. And that's going to then, once we're in that state of psychological safety, then you could have inclusion, you could have true belonging. And to me, that's where it's genuine. And you probably know this. There's a big difference between, oh, I'm going through compliance training to be inclusive and understand diversity, but to embrace it. And I think the beauty of this is when you're in these mindful states and intentional and psychological safety is there, it's genuinely embracing inclusion and diversity. And that's where things start to magically get better.
Agreed. And that's really true equity too, because I understand and I'm open that giving you what you need doesn't mean that I'm giving up something. I'm
Yes.
actually, yeah. And
Yeah.
that to me is where we get to true equity, not just the compliance version of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Heather. I mean, we're out of time already. We're a minute over magically. That was
Just
quick,
that.
but I appreciate your input. And Sean, I guess we'll throw it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dan and Heather. It was supposed to be Rudy, but Rudy just disconnected.
Okay.
And so actually, he just came back. So I'm going to bring Rudy back up to kind of closing up the diabetes here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan and Heather, for a wonderful session. And on this note, I would like to thank all our speakers, panelists, and participants for coming together to make the third edition of DiFest a meaningful conversation. A big thank you to our belonging partner, Newsela, for making this year possible. Please send us your feedback on the sessions that you enjoyed and also what you would like to listen to and learn from in the future. Through our public platforms and through our customized learning experiences, we want to bring you and support your professional growth and commitments towards making your workplace more inclusive and bias-free. On this note, we wish to officially close DiFest Global 2022. Blessings and good wishes for